with CEOs and millionaires. I've never seen my vision be more crystal clear. Look in the mirror, see the change in who I used to be. I kept going, knew success would come eventually. But ask about me back then, they said I wouldn't make it. Nowadays they doubt less and tend to ask for favors. Poetic music, that's realness, don't let them tell you different. And if you ever lost in doubt, then follow your intuition. These words of wisdom is for those who's trying to find their purpose. Don't be living just to die, cause only death is certain. I'm working hard so I can toast to my accomplishments. Cause see, I lost it all and I ain't been the same since. I'm more focused, more ambitious, more everything. Grew up with nothing, now I appreciate the finer things. I know it's real when at the shows they ask for autographs. And now they know the name, they ain't gotta ask.
All right, we're live. We're not live, but we're recording. So next guest is a friend of mine from years back. He's not in Denver anymore, but he is one of the guys I respect immensely. He's been in education for how many years now?
Over 10 now. Graduated in 2006, took a couple years. So yeah, 10, 11, 12-ish.
Gotcha. And so this, without further ado, this is Elliot Stevens. Thanks for doing this, man.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah, I think it was an important topic. We're going to be discussing education and some of the pitfalls and some of the maybe the reasons why some of the education is kind of declining in the U.S. and maybe some of the institutional knowledge that Elliot has from being a teacher, actually teaching overseas as well, and then coming back and being part of the administration at his school today, really is going to paint a decent picture from different perspectives along his career. And he definitely probably has the knowledge base on like what could be done to improve it, what's working and what's not. So with that in mind, you know, America has been in, you know, I was looking at some of the statistics, you know, before we start talking. And sorry about that. And based on the statistics, you know, we've slowly been declining in a sense. And do you think that has to do with the culture that we have in America regarding schooling up to the public education level before university or trade schools or things like that? Is it a cultural thing that we just we're lacking the buy-in from all the brokers within the education to include the parents, the teachers, and things of that nature? What do you think is that leading component to that decline right now?
I think there's a few things. You know, I think about the way that people can turn on, you know, a device or go online or see someone that, you know, bypassed sort of that traditional pathway, and they found to you know, make a project or come up with an idea that they could really not just live off of, but live very comfortably off of. So I think that there are some that would say, well, this isn't the right path for me, and I don't need to get some of these other concepts and skills and knowledge that I wouldn't necessarily apply in my everyday life, but that make me a more, you know, well-rounded, a holistic type of member of society. So having access to all of these other stories, while it could be inspirational, I also think that you know, you're not necessarily going to be able to always jump into something and find that level of instant success. And I think that when young people are starting to look online, they don't have necessarily the context and the stories behind how these people got to where they are and all the work that they had to do. They just see the result of it, right? So if there are, whether it's Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or other social media platforms where you can just see that net result and not, you know, no one's posting all the sweat equity. That's not as sexy as the finished product. I think that's part of it. I think that, you know, teachers are complacent with tenure. I know this is a touchy subject for a lot of folks. I just received tenure for the first time. I've always moved before I've received it. And it doesn't necessarily say like, all right, first day of year 4, now I'm just locked in and going to coast. But you can see how that can begin to chip away at your edge as a professional over time. Renewal for education is just labor. It's not a whole lot of original thought at the forefront of that process. And then for parents, I think it's hard because so many families need to have 2 or more jobs to support a family. It's hard for parents to have the time to do what they want, to support their kids, to give them opportunities, because it's always, I got to get to this shift or do that particular task. And kids are left to fend for themselves probably more than they should, or than the parents would want them to. So I think it's a lot of things that have sort of led us to this point, with education not where we would all like it to be.
I mean, that's a very realistic answer, and I appreciate that. I'm actually optimistic by your answer, in a sense that I think that parents obviously want what's best for their children. There's only so much time involved in the day, and the necessity to provide takes, is paramount in that initiative. And second, maybe third, comes school, and they just don't have the time to allocate to ensure that school is beneficial for that particular individual. And so that responsibility inherently is put on the community, which would enhance, maybe after school programs, to the teachers being more involved, and that puts a strain on resources and allocations across the board. And so it's a systemic cycle of a strain down on every stakeholder within a child's education. And it's kind of sad in a sense that, and a lot of this unfortunately is predicated on your zip code, on the allocation of resources that are available for those particular students. And so we've kind of set up a quasi caste system based on where you can afford to live, based on the resources that are going to be provided to you. With that being said, can we in the future provide some kind of educational equity moving forward for kids?
I mean, I'd love to, and I would even go farther than saying it's a quasi caste system. I mean, that's what it is. I think that so many zip codes and counties, or whatever the system is, depending on the state, there's no doubt that there are, straight lines between property values and school success, and access to those properties are made all the more challenging for those that are underserved and underrepresented. In terms of equity moving forward, it's hard to put a finger on like the one lever to push or to pull. I think that one thing that everybody could stand to benefit from and to improve would be communication, and the ability to have that communication, whether it's between community members and the schools, at larger groups, or families with the teachers. And, echoing what you were suggesting earlier, of not that there's a lack of interest, but the lack of availability. And it's this touchy balance, right? Because we were just home, distance learning, hybrid model, where kids were in their houses learning through a screen. And then it was the floodgates were open. So parents had access to portals, online programs and platforms where they could shoot off messages any time of day or any time of night. And then it was so much more of the ticky-tack, small potatoes kinds of things the teachers weren't prepared for or really expecting. So that was almost a lost opportunity of, here's this open venue or open forum, but we didn't set up good guardrails to make those conversations more meaningful. And instead it was, I can't do number 12 while I'm in math, or my kid doesn't want to do the reading. And then the teachers felt compelled to respond immediately. Mm-hmm. But having some way to get more conversations where there aren't just about, well, Ben did a great job on this quarter, so here's his report, or Elliot really blew it on this quarter. If it's more than just grades, mm-hmm. and there are more avenues to point out those points of intersection, I think then you can really build more relationships that are meaningful, not just based on the academic success or failures of your student.
And so you feel we missed an opportunity to bridge that gap within the communication last year, having this kind of quasi distance learning for kids of all ages, to where the teachers just were ill-advised or ill-prepared to handle the barrage of communication that was coming at them all of a sudden from parents that, like you mentioned, like might have not had the ability to do so before because of all the issues with work and the time constraints and what have you, but they now are more actively involved, and we didn't jump on that chance to bridge that gap in the communication.
I think it goes both ways. I think that nothing the parents were using was necessarily new. I think that the conditions in which they were using them and the stress that they were under to navigate their own careers at home, if they had to work remotely, as well as keeping their kid online so they could get their work done. Parents saw much more of the day-to-day, hour-to-hour work that was happening in the buildings. And parents are always going to want to advocate for their kids. But then to see it and then to say, okay, well, I don't know what you're doing with this thing. Let me just pop off a quick message to the teacher. Well, when you get that 30 times in the course of a day or more, depending on how many kids and how many parents are looking at these things, that fire hose didn't have any sort of regulator on it. So parents were interested and able and willing to do some of that work, but it was, instead of like warming up to a conversation, just kicking the door in and start screaming. And everybody was stressed. So I think that teachers are trying to figure out how do they get their work done, make sure the kids can grow a full academic year. Parents were doing all these things. So I think that both sides missed this chance to consider what would be good rules of engagement when it comes to that almost more constant access, if such a phrase exists, to communication. Just because you can doesn't mean that you need to the instant you have a question. Just, give it a minute and put a thought together.
Right. Like the easy button or what have you, like, oh, this is like, maybe you should figure it out together collectively with your child. And that kind of creates bonding moments too, in a sense of like, I don't know this answer. Let me actually go research this so I actually can articulate this to you, and it coming from me might actually be more beneficial than coming from somebody else. With that, we're talking about technology. What are some of the downsides of technology that you've seen? I know that, let's say, from the workplace perspective, there's already kind of some studies coming out where like people are just as productive, if not more productive, because of less commuting time and things of that nature. What have you seen on the positive side of the technology, and then also some of the negatives within the technology from a school perspective for the students?
Sure. Yeah, I think that a universal positive with technology when it relates to lesson planning and things like that is the ability to replicate stuff. So if I'm building up a lesson and you and I are teaching the same concept, I can share that with you digitally. You can make some modifications to it, but the majority of it is done, right? Whereas if I'm doing a hands-on build on like a science experiment or something, we can't just pick up that build and move it down the hall. So the collaboration side for teachers, I think, was a positive with that, and then being able to archive it, bring it up again, or have a framework that you can use down the line. So that's gone well. And then with the technology for the teachers, there's really this compulsion to stay kind of half a step ahead of where the kids are, so that when you're opening up something new, using a new platform, you can feel confident that you're doing something productive with your class in the time that you have. So kind of forcing people to be okay sucking at something. That's a hard thing to kind of game out in a hypothetical scenario. So when you're pushed into doing that, it's really, you're going to have to figure it out. And I think people came away with a renewed sense of confidence in, okay, we could do this. It wasn't the best that we were hoping for, but we found some ways to make it work. And I think those are going to be lessons that those experiences will carry forward. The negative side of it is that when the anonymity behind a keyboard is large, especially when you have a beef with somebody. So if there's a misunderstanding, or the ability to either assume good intent or negative intent, and within professionals, they're just as guilty as parents to teachers of fire off something and then let them deal with it, and not having that face to face, reading the body language, hearing the tone of the voice. With so many people working at different hours of the day, you didn't have this collective time that you're in the building. My building, kids walk in at 9:17, staff have to be in the building at 8:15. So those 60 minutes, you're doing work, but part of your work is building relationships with your coworkers and just talking about something or being a part of a conversation. And that was missing. I think teachers are inherently social, interactive based people. And when you lose that, it turns the color down a little bit on what you're able to do and how you're able to do it successfully.
Yeah. And then with technology obviously being, in the forefront with a lot of these things, as misconduct regarding cheating and things like that been on the rise with some of the stuff that you're having to deal with?
I mean, a little bit. And it comes from a good place. Our district does these 3 main testing seasons: fall, winter, and spring. And these aren't the state mandated tests. These are local jurisdiction tests. And we use them to kind of get a sense of where kids are at the beginning of the year, how they're doing in the middle of the year, and how do we do at the end of the year. And we want the data. So when we had to do some testing remotely and the kids were at home, just unfortunately, you would have kids that were in, it's all percentile ranks, national norms. Kids were in the fall in the teens, the 20s, and their trend was on the lower end of things. And then suddenly when they're home, those percentiles jump up to the high 80s, low 90s. So, I mean, it's likely that there was some help.
Right.
And that's so. But within the building itself, within the 4 walls of the building, not really. Yeah. There's a number of applications that we use for the tests anyway that do keep them locked down. There are different versions that are sort of filtered around the classroom, but it's really more when they're outside of the school itself, getting that support from home.
What about the social dynamic of the students coming back? Have you noticed a little bit of a change on them not having been around each other and having to interact in a different way?
Yeah. So that was a goofy thing. Our building was full distance learning for a number of months, and then we started to come back in. So we started in a hybrid, which for our district was 2 days in the building, 2 days at home, and then the 5th day, in some cases, was like a social emotional day. They don't call it a day off, but it was a lighter day. We went to full distance and we sort of dialed back to this hybrid model. And then when we came back full distance, just in the last couple of months, it was the younger half of the school first. So kinder through 2nd grade came back for 2 weeks. 3rd grade through 5th grade stayed home, and then they came back the 2 weeks after that. When the kinder through 2nd grade kids came back, it was just this high energy. We were worried about keeping the kids apart from each other, but the interaction was just there. They were stoked to be back with teachers or to meet teachers for the first time. Some of the 1st grade students from this year, right, when they were kindergartners, they were in the building until about this time last year, and then they were gone. They didn't come back from March until the end of the year. So they've missed that being in the building, that collective space. So they were just thrilled. When the older kids came back, it was an entirely different experience. Behaviors were bubbling up almost immediately. The freedom that they had on the older side to be home alone for a number of hours, which is, legal in Minnesota. There are certain benchmarks of the age and whatever, but they had a lot more independence, and they were a lot more savvy with using their iPads. Our district is at a 1-to-1 at this point, to do things that weren't education related. So when they had to come back and sit in that chair, raise their hand, sign out to go to the bathroom, follow the directions when they were told to follow them, that was a much harder, and we're still struggling with a number of students to make that switch back into the school building and being a part of that group where you're not making as many local decisions as your teacher is.
And then what's the criteria for you guys setting up the classroom and everything like that? Is it like 6 feet per desk in between? Like, what kind of protocol do you guys have with these students coming back?
Yeah, so it's all under this strongly recommended, not absolutely required. So what we have done is kids are wearing masks all day except when they're eating, and when they're outside. We had to wear shields on top of the masks for a while, and then because it muffled your voice, people had these like tour guide headsets that were over their mask and under their shield and had like a pack on their hip. That was awful. And I didn't have to wear those microphones. I had to do the mask with the shield thing. Mm-hmm. That was one part of it. Otherwise, with the spacing, we just recently kind of folded back on having a number of seating charts throughout the day. So you had a chart in your homeroom class where the kids were sitting. You had a chart in the cafeteria where the kids were sitting, and they were supposed to stay with those that are adjacent to them. And the rationale being, if one kid is a positive case, right, then you kind of take down their most immediate perimeter of kids, and potentially you could keep the rest of the kids in the classroom. It hasn't worked that way. We've had 2 schools shut down already for 2 weeks. 1 school shut down for 1 week. We've had whole classes shut down. It's not really to the point where you're cutting a class in half and a third are staying home and 2/3 are in the building. So we're relaxing that a bit in the past couple of weeks. Mind you, our staff is pretty much 85% have both shots. And they're still working on finishing up those final 15%, at least getting the offer, right? It's not a compulsory thing to stay employed, but because a lot of folks are getting those vaccines and they're making it to the 2-week window post second vaccine, that combined with the fact that we just had to shut down whole classes, they're getting a little less strict on keeping all the kids in the exact same spot for the full day.
Got it. And then just to kind of sum up COVID, I mean, it's been almost exactly a year since a lot of this stuff shut down. What do you think the secondary and tertiary effects are in regards to the education value that students have received or, missed out on during this time, and how that's going to affect moving forward? Kids not only from today, but the kids that had to stay home with their parents the entire time and didn't get that pre-K kind of interaction and education in that same way. What do you think are going to be some of those effects?
I mean, there's no doubt that if you go strictly by data, it's going to trend downward. I mean, there's no way to replicate some of those experiences in a remote setting. Mm-hmm. And that's no indictment on teachers or the work. I mean, teachers were working hard, kids are working hard, but you just cannot have that same level of intensity when it comes to just being in those lessons in the same manner for those number of hours, for that number of months that you missed. So like we've got kids now where we're just starting to do what we're calling intervention groups, which is a normal thing that we do in a school year. But we would start in the fall. Well, we weren't here in the fall and we couldn't do it the way we wanted to. So even doing those intervention groups with kids that would need it, we are 6 months behind schedule just for this school year. So I don't know if they're going to redo norms and just make it more palatable, or if we're going to say we're just going to try to, if a second grade kid is going to third grade next year, we're going to teach them third grade information. And if it's almost like a language immersion where if you saturate them with that higher level stuff, they'll hopefully be able to make those connections and the teachers will modify things. You're not just going to put their heads down and push, right? But if we try to backfill from the past 18 months, we're never going to catch up.
Right.
So I think that's the strategy going forward, and then we'll have to adjust.
That's interesting.
There's no playbook. We can't just dust off a binder and say, well, what did we do last time?
Yeah.
So hopefully that's going to get us at least started, and then we'll be able to scaffold and help along the way.
And so with that, I would assume that the metrics for success are going to be a little bit more lenient moving forward, just given all those examples that you just mentioned. But then secondly, are teachers and staff and administration within a school given more education or continuing education on how to deal with this moving forward at all? Is there something being provided by the city, by the state in some kind of facet as far as
Yeah, I mean, I'm expecting that there will be, but the people that are making this they're the same as you and me. I mean, they're, of course, they're professionals in education, but they don't have some crystal ball of here's what you do and here's what you don't do. So the decision makers in the district will be and continue to have these conversations on, how robust can we make summer school opportunities? What can we do for the fall for teachers? How can we give them what they need? While also letting them breathe for a minute and not feel like they have to come in for those 10 weeks, because you need these teachers to keep teaching, right?
Yeah.
So if they get any more burnt out, I mean, we had 3 retirements in my building because of COVID concerns that they didn't come back in the fall. And it was the right decision, but the institutional knowledge that they had and the support that they offer by being there is not to be minimized either. So yeah, there are discussions afoot on what we can do, but there's no saying how successful it'll be.
And has your retention rate over the last year dipped a little bit due to COVID? Have you had more people just take, little sabbatical of teaching, until things get back to normal, or just, get out of the industry entirely? Or
on the staffing side, no. And that never really crossed my mind. I feel like once teachers get into the school year, for better or worse, they're going to see their way through it, unless they're really just either in legal trouble or they're brand new and they made a terrible mistake. A lot of families, though, have kept their kids. Our district provides an online academy that was part of the infrastructure here before COVID. So it was robust and it had staffing and it had curriculum. Many families kept their kids there, even though we are back full time. They have the option, they're allowed to do it, and it's still part of the public school system. And that's going to play a big role in staffing for the brick and mortar side of if you do go down in attendance and a section and a grade level is no longer necessary, then that staff member either gets displaced or has to look for a different position. So those types of unintended consequences are going to be felt through the summer, because parents can keep their kids into that online academy up until really any point. There's no cutoff for swapping over from that to the brick and mortar side.
Got it. Let's talk a little bit about our education system as far as the structure goes. And I always was interested by that because I obviously grew up in Europe, and the education system obviously is vastly different in how it's tiered out and everything else. Maybe you can elaborate on that in the same way from your experience in Korea on teaching over there overseas. Can you give an example of what a typical school year looks like as far as the breaks and things like that are concerned? And like when, for example, teachers start prepping for the new school year all the way to like that next summer?
So I can speak first to my experience in the United States. Typically staffing starts about this time in the spring, which is its own blend of hell, because if folks know they're going to be non-renewed, they keep going to work for 3 more months, and that just blows for a number of reasons. Once you get through staffing and you know what your enrollment's going to be for the fall, then you start to have preliminary discussions with those team members on what's the data from this current year, how are we going to do some grade level assignments, and how are we going to get these kids into the best fit for their next academic year moving forward. And you start to have those discussions among the teams as well, between those adjacent grade levels. Over the summer, there are a number of opportunities, most places, to do some professional development, some continuing education learning. It could be on something that you really want to improve or something you want to try that's different. A lot of school districts will use those summer months to do some of that, but it's typically optional. And then in August, as you're gearing up towards Labor Day, when most schools in the United States are getting back into classrooms, you have about a week or so of people are back in the building. There are no kids, but you're gearing up for this beginning of the fall. You're doing some professional development on new initiatives, new curriculum packages, and you're starting to set some goals for the school year. Then as you're getting into the school year, you'll start to do some data collection with initial assessments, like I was talking about earlier, that fall kind of assessment package. And then you'll start to look at putting some kids in the groups within your classroom. So then how can I target my instruction? You'll do some whole group work, but then you'll do some small group work. And you'll have those data conversations in the fall, again in the winter, and you're tweaking along the way, but you're trying to build some routines. I've always found that kids and adults are most successful when they can anticipate what's coming next, and they can feel like these are the guardrails that I have. If I want to think outside of those, that's great, but these are my limits as I'm starting and kind of building that structure. And then you've got your breaks sort of a little bit in the fall. Thanksgiving, the big holiday, and then obviously at the end of December between Christmas and New Year's, and then spring break. So you're kind of, once you get through the winter, you're kind of leapfrogging to what's the next academic benchmark, when's my next mental break, and then in the spring, you're gearing up for older grade levels to do the state mandated assessments. In most states, that's starting in 3rd grade up through 12th grade through high school. So then the school does kind of get shut down for those weeks. You're still in class, you're still doing the work, but it really is geared towards creating that environment for the kids to have as successful a test as possible for those few weeks in the spring.
Now, I don't know if this is true or not. Maybe you can vouch for it or not. But the reason we have the long extended break in the United States was due to harvest season back in the day. Is that true?
That's the same myth that I've been fed for years, so I would believe it, yeah.
Okay. And so with that, I know in Germany, like we have 6 weeks in the summer generally for summer vacation. What was it like in Korea per se? And then what do you think is better? Having that extended break to get everybody to kind of unwind from being in that rigorous scheduling. And like you said, most people know it. Do you think we could eventually get to a point where we have basically year-round school with longer breaks in between in that facet?
Yeah. So in Korea, the way that my contract worked, I worked summer to summer, and they turned half of their staff over at the 6-month point. So that was also a private school, so it was a little bit of a different blend. And people that sent their kids there knew it was not a public school. So I don't have the experience on the public school side. There are major holidays on their calendar. Some of them do overlap with, like New Year's on that calendar, but then they have their harvest holiday in the fall. And there were some longer weekends and things like that, but that was a very different kind of thing. Most people that were there were not there for many years in terms of the foreign staff, the Americans. So you knew that you were going to do this short burst of work and then you were going to be out the door. So if you burned a bridge or two along the way, then you burned a bridge or two along the way. And for that school at the time anyway, you didn't need to be a trained educator to go over there. So they wanted your accent. They didn't want a Canadian or a British or a South African or Australian or New Zealand. They wanted an American accent.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not an equal opportunity employee type of situation over there. So they also wanted headshots. So read into that as you. I mean, this was this is one building, this is one school, but that was their thing. So you knew it going in the door. Well, they still took me, so clearly they lowered that bar as well.
Well, I was saying like you and your wife, they both made it, right? So you made the cut.
Well, she was there before, so she had the in, and then they were stuck with me. I guess that's the way to look at it.
Hey, sometimes you need a great supporting actor, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think a year-round school year would be conducive to a better education in America?
There's no doubt that more time in the building would lead to smarter kids, right? Just to dumb that down completely. Um, However, I'll say that there's a trade-off to that, right? So when I was teaching in Korea, I was teaching at one point kindergarten kids. No, preschool kids. Excuse me, preschool kids in English. Um, and I was using a curriculum book that was literally the same book that I taught American kindergarten kids out of. It was the exact same publisher, the same copyright date. So I'm teaching kids a year younger than American kindergarten students. And we did a full year's worth of American curriculum in 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, these kids were conversant in a second language before they were done wetting the bed at night.
Yeah.
The trade-off to that is, though, they're going to school 6 days a week. They're going to school 10 hours a day or so when they're up to middle school. And the social pressures to advance are astronomical. So I think that that's not saying it's got to be a one or the other, but I do think that some of the freedoms that are so important and inherently valued in the United States would, be set aside to accommodate that. Not to mention that the way that our country runs things, we don't federalize public education across the board, right? There are certain things that we do, but when it comes to calendars and things like that, that's a state to state type of thing, at least as far as I understand it. So I think that would be a heavy lift to get all those jurisdictions on board with it, as well as onboarding your staff to say, here's what it is. You're going to get paid more, but you're going to be giving up some things too. You're going to have an exodus of folks that say, that's not what I want. And that's fine. If that's what you're wanting to go for and they don't want that, then they shouldn't be in that career. But that would be a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
And it would definitely change the outcome. There's no doubt it would change the outcome.
It's funny you were mentioning that with the school kids, because I went to German school until second grade, and then switched over. I remember this distinctly because my mom and I were laughing at how easy third grade was. Like the stuff that I learned already, I was already speaking some French. The STEM kind of curriculum, I was taking fourth grade math in going into second grade. And these parameters in that same sense, because we were living off the military base, and then my mom knew that we were moving back to the States eventually. So she wanted to integrate us ahead of time to go to the class, to be able to have an easier transition, like when we moved to the States again in 1988. And I think overall it was beneficial, because staying in German school and then switching over would have been tough in some ways, but then also extremely boring in other ways. Like if you're that far ahead of the other folks in certain things, besides the writing and the other things that are going to catch up, I mean, talk about being destructive or, behavior issues and things of that nature, because you're just that much ahead of the game. Germany has a weird system where they tend to split off people to create the most value for the group. And kind of what you were talking about with these mini groups within the classroom, that happens after fourth grade. You're on your track to either go to college, to kind of do the regular high school, or to end up in the trade school route. What are your thoughts on if America were to push that initiative in that way, where we're just being honest with ourselves and saying, you know what? Not every kid's going to be Einstein. Not every kid's going to, make it in the same way on an education level, but there are so many other professions where these people would be killing it just based on the aptitude on pushing a different narrative of success, and then also just the sheer willpower of the basic skills of like small business, like, you know, doing construction and other things where a lot of those tradesmen have literally retired, and the people that are in those positions now that are running those businesses and things like that, they don't have the aptitude to be doing it. They're like the B and C players of that industry, but there's nobody else. And so how do we get over the stigma of not going to college, but then going in a different direction in our own education system?
Yeah, if you could answer that, I would love to know, because it's a problem, right? I mean, there is, even if you stopped that stigma in its tracks today for all future students, I think that it is so baked into the psyche of, here's the metric of how you are successful, that you do these things, you achieve these goals, you get this paper, and then you go and do the thing for 40 years. And that doesn't need to be the case, especially with the inertia that the world is moving towards, the interconnectivity, the ability to move things and people and products and ideas. There's always gonna be, in most cases, somebody else trying to do the same thing that you're doing. So why not try to connect with those people or create those hubs here and not rely on other places? I think that it's doing the educational system and the country at large a disservice if you can't begin to move in that direction. I think that we are guilty of saying that you haven't met my kid, he's the best that ever was. Maybe, probably not. So, and there's nothing wrong with doing these other things, right? I mean, you can be really good at a job and just hate your life. And then to what end, right? Like, so what? Wouldn't it be lovely if we could all do something that we're good at and that gives us joy or gives us some sense of personal fulfillment? I think that losing that fulfillment, me as an educator, right, when I was home and my gig in my building, I really work for other teachers. That's my job on a daily basis. They didn't have me because they didn't need me, because I wasn't in the building with them. So some of those things that I was doing on a regular basis, I just couldn't do because of the environment where I was. I could get on the phone, I could write emails, I could do projects, but it wasn't the same as being there and bridging those gaps for my colleagues. And that was really hard for me for the first few months. That was really challenging for me to feel like, well, what is it that I am right now? If I am supposed to be this learning specialist role for these hours of the day, having that fulfillment to me is, it can't be unique just to me, right? We all want to feel good about what we're doing. So even if you go to the college and you get the degree, it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily love what you're doing. So why not find a way to create avenues that you don't have to be ashamed of, but to say, this is a perfectly reasonable, good way to spend your life and to learn something and bring it to another individual, another generation. I don't know how you break that stigma, but it's there. Yeah.
How do you, well, I mean, there's one thing I think we could do from a federal level if we got a lot of, initiative behind it, and it's to treat school debt as regular debt, that it's not guaranteed from the U.S. government to be held on to in that sense. And I think educators and universities would take a harder look at people and not just let every Tom, Dick, and Harry into their school because of the factor of that maybe they don't finish. And there's obviously you're not going to win it every time. But at the same time, you're going to be a lot more choosy with who you're going to allow in if they can't pay, because they have no repercussions on any of the selection process other than, yeah, this person meets the criteria and maybe their parents can pay and that's all we care about. Or they're going to indebt themselves and not even get the credentials that we were mentioning before. And now you have the cyclical poverty of pursuit of education, not having the actual credentials to go along with it. And now you have this debt collar on your life, without even getting to that next level of financial stability that potential credential would allow you to earn more in that facet. And so I think from that perspective, that would probably be the first thing I would try to change, in that way that people would have to really want to go to university to know, and holding all stakeholders accountable. Like, we're entering this relationship, we need to ensure that, one, that you have the aptitude to be here in a sense. And then secondly, we want to ensure that the willingness and the drive and the delayed gratification of this endeavor is going to be what you want as well. Because if it sucks, let's say you theoretically go bankrupt when you're 20 and you have school debt, you have 7 years to wait off, and at 28, 29 years old, you could have went a different way. And then you can still be like, okay, I was bankrupt, but it was school debt, and I ended up buying a house and having the other things that happen because we allow for debt forgiveness after a certain period of time. And so I think with having that debt on your conscience, and I didn't really understand the complexity of debt until I failed in business. And I think that is something that you don't know until you're in it. And we don't talk about that a lot in society, because everybody theoretically is living a little bit more out of their means than they should. And then when something actually happens, you have that around your neck. With the system, I'm just thinking about what we were talking about here a second ago. So I have a couple friends like back in Germany that did, it's called like a trade, like Ausbildung, where, for example, one guy was a car salesman. So he went and he studied like how to be a salesman, like in an apprenticeship for a year, and then went and worked under a car dealership for 2 years. And then after that time frame, he was getting paid. I mean, he still had to live at home per se, but he's making like, $1,000 a month, something like that. For an 18-year-old, that's not bad if you don't have any room and board kind of situation to have to worry about. But he learned his skills. He learned how to talk to people. He learned everything else. And at the end of the time, just the same way our collegiate students have internships, you're offered a job, either afterwards or not. And then you can kind of decide if you're going to go with that or move on into, going to another dealership or something like that. With that, I just feel that those life experiences are so valuable in a sense of, nowadays, I think with the parenting and trying to protect your kids from failure rather than allowing them to actually fail is really detrimental to their well-being. Because if you've been acting like the fullback in football for them until they graduate from college, and then they get out into the real world and they get to their first job and they're like, oh man, I'm not making a difference. And be like, you're 22 years old. You're not supposed to. You're the cog in the wheel right now. And I guess the question I have for you is, how much in the education field is the psychology of encouragement, but then also allowing them to actually fail a little bit before helping them out?
It's a touchy thing, right? Because I think most teachers that are wanting to be good educators have to find that line for themselves personally as the leader in that classroom, as well as what is the line for each kid. Like, you don't want to break a 9-year-old, but you also need to help that kiddo find what is resilience. Even if you can't define it or you don't know exactly what it is, how can you create that environment for those kids so that they can have that sense of, here's how I navigated through that time or through that situation. At the same time, in many cases, it's not a hypothetical, how do I make this for these kids? But they're coming in the door with any number of brutal situations outside of the home. I mean, I've worked in the community where I am now is a by and large a privileged upper middle class community, and there are pockets of our district that are expanding and growing where it is not as well to do. And there are students that come in with stories that you would have a hard time believing. I've worked in the suburbs of Baltimore where you had families that were really having a hard time with different situations. So knowing what those kids need, giving them a safe place so that they can learn and feel empowered to do the learning, but also pushing themselves, that's almost more important than the arithmetic or the spelling, right? So there's that sense of life lesson that you can't even necessarily clearly define to youngsters, but that you kind of know what that target goal is when you get ready to hand them off to the next teacher. That all being said, when it comes to academics, teachers are assessed on the data of their kids. So you're kind of you're finding yourself in this place where you want kids to build that resilience and build those problem solving skills. But at the end of the year, you're looking at your data. And a lot of times, one of the questions in those discussions is how many kids grew academically according to those charts and how many kids didn't. There are goals that are set for the kids. Did you reach your goal? Did you not reach your goal? So unfortunately, there's not always the time or the inclination to say, well, listen, here's where he's like, so here's an example. I had a 5th grader when I was teaching in Maryland that came in at a 2nd grade reading level. The reading teacher and we had a reading interventionist, worked with this boy all year long. We brought in the high school football players. He was helping clean up things in the cafeteria because he loved talking to the custodial staff, and that was his time making connections. He grew 2 grade levels. So in 5th grade, he went from a 2nd grade to a 4th grade reading level, and he bombed his 5th grade assessment. That sucks, right? So here's a kid that poured his heart into his school year, and if all he looked at was that number at the end, the teacher would say, well, I must have failed because we didn't make enough progress. Mm-hmm. Here I am 13 years later telling you that story. It made an impression on me. But so how can teachers feel like those stories are validated and heard and expected to, you're going to have these stories. You're not always going to have everybody at that upper level of things. Don't penalize me as an educator if I didn't make it for all of them, because there's a whole lot that went on aside from just that metric at the end of the year.
No, that's a great example, man. With the testing, I know some of these Scandinavian countries don't test at all. Do you feel that we test too much? Do you think it's valuable overall? And do you feel that at the end of the day that we're too metric centric when it comes to our children, and we just don't let, the same way like we allow personalities to grow and develop at their own pace, why don't we do that with education as well?
Yeah, I don't know why we don't let that happen with education. I think that it depends on what you're doing with the data. So if you're going to rank teachers, rank schools, rank kids, then no, let's not waste our time with that. If it does allow you to see where there's a gap, if I got a kid that's been part of a transient family, they're coming in and in 3rd grade, he's unable to read. Well, I got to know what does he need and where are the holes that I can fill. And there I do need something. Because if he's moving around, right, I'm immediately thinking he's not going to trust me. He's going to wonder how long am I in this building, and he's not going to want to perform what he can do to some new guy. So there's got to be a way that I can kind of peek under the hood and get a few different data points to see what does he know, what does he need, and what is he not showing me. So in that case, the data is critical. Mm-hmm. When it comes to the volume of testing that we're up to now, and if we're spending 2 weeks doing testing and we're spending an hour and a half talking about the data, if we're not using that data again on a regular basis, then that is getting to be a little too much. With education, especially with little ones, data gets obsolete in a matter of weeks because you are constantly teaching along the way. So if you're not doing something with that information soon, then it's like, well, then spend your time doing something else.
Yeah. what if, we're talking about these kind of examples where kids just kind of fall by the wayside, a lot of times based on circumstance outside of their own, you know, outside of their own realm of influence. What can we do better as a society, as a community, to get those people essentially not to go from like a school to prison pipeline, if you will? I don't know, maybe not in your district, but in other places, where high school dropouts are prevalent. Has there been any initiatives from the Department of Education or anything like that to, okay, you dropped out, this may not be your thing, and school's not for everybody. What's next? Where can we fit you in society where you can grow as a person, you can still have some kind of skills, have that self-worth that you were talking about earlier, and that fulfillment in performing a role of some kind and moving in that sense? Have you heard of any kind of initiatives like that?
I mean, I can't say like system wide that I know what those things would look like. You do hear about like restaurants that are run by a chef that will hire, folks that were in prison that have been released and that will try to build apprenticeships. But you kind of hear those as, onesies, twosies in different places. I don't know what structures exist, in all honesty, of if you drop out, it's like, and you don't go to prison, right? So then what do you do if you could be eligible for some of these things? How do you get folks that are not in that position at the moment to buy into something different? Right. Because I think that's really what it is, right? I think that it's if the emotions for the individual aren't there for education, if they're not invested in that, then what is it that they could be invested in that can be meaningful and part of their journey towards happiness and success in life? I don't know what that would be.
Yeah. I mean, it's something to consider, because I think that this model of teaching, it's almost from a Baroque period, in a sense of, I think our teaching education system stems from like Prussia, from back in the 1790s, 1800s, as far as the timelines are concerned and what we're teaching. Do you feel that the subjects that we're teaching today are relevant in today's world when you have so much information at your fingertips?
I mean, there's always room for more, right? Like, especially in the last few years, there's this undercurrent of discussion on civics, right? How can we bring civics down towards the elementary side of things, so it's not this 11th grade spring semester course that you just take once and you're done. I think that when it comes to some of these high stakes tests in the spring, that drives instruction. I mean, that's just what it is. So reading and math, and those are good things to spend time on, right? But
sure,
if there's not an appreciation for history and the story of your community and building that connection to your community, those are opportunities. Thinking what you were asking about a moment ago, if somebody's not going to leave their community right away because they don't see that outlet through access to different types of educational platforms, if they're going to be local, then what can the schools do to build some more awareness, build some more pride in the community, so that there is this sense of, well, this is where I'm living. What can I do to help it? How can I sustain it? How can I improve it? Some of those types of things, I think, could be helpful short-term and long-term.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you guys had any issues with school security during these times, or even before, regarding, obviously, we have the issue of shootings and other things, and obviously we don't want to talk about that too much, but obviously with COVID that kind of went down. Do you think that extra pressure on a physical space of safety has led to some of those declines even before COVID in some of the testing and things like that in schools?
I think it's hard for me to get inside the head of a student who is disturbed and unwell. I think that schools for many people represent a lot of things, but if it is sort of a pillar of the community, and if that community has wronged you, or you interpret that community as having wronged you, I can appreciate why schools were more of a target before they were being used all the time, right? And now with coronavirus, it's not like people were shooting up empty schools.
Right.
So before coronavirus, we were in the middle of doing major security updates anyway. Our superintendent is former military. He has put student safety at the top of his list of priorities. And there were dollars allocated, if not spent, on reinforcing doors, having different systems, redesigning the entry points to schools in the district to make them more secure. So I'm curious if those dollars are still there for this. And most schools are running a deficit now because they were just having to buy up all these different systems and plexiglass and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So I'd imagine we'll get back to that at some point. But it is, it's a sad thing, right? When you're home for a year, 8-10 months or so, and you are talking to your colleagues. My wife and I were talking about it. But I don't think we've heard about a school shooting in a while. Right? That's a little twisted, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. So looking forward, though, so you've taught at all levels. You've taught overseas. Let's just theoretically, like if I got into politics and I needed a Department of Education head, what would be your like top 2 or 3 priorities if I put you in that position to like really affect change on a macro level? What would you want to implement or give a go, and what would you just think that it's kind of a wish, make a wish situation in that sense, but you would still go for it?
I think there's got to start to be a trade-off between teacher pay and pulling back on tenure. I don't know many other industries where, and I got my tenure relatively later in my career, right? I got it when I was 35. Unless my job dissolves, I have this until I don't want it anymore. My job's a little different because it's not based on enrollment, but my position in this building is not going anywhere. That's wrong, right? I shouldn't feel like I've got 25, 30 years that unless I really royally wake up and say, let me figure out how to screw this up, like this is my gig until I don't want it anymore.
Yeah.
The trade-off of that is that I don't have to negotiate a contract on my own behalf. I don't have to negotiate my health insurance anymore. You could very easily become complacent. And I've met plenty of teachers that are at the midpoint or the beginning or the end of their careers that are complacent. And that I don't think drives initiative or motivation to learn new things if you're not necessarily looking over your shoulder all the time, but you're thinking of, I am an employee at will. I'm going to operate differently than if I have this position that I can keep as long as I want. So I think there's got to be some discussion on how can you pull back on that, but at the same time, what can you offer teachers to feel? Because the perennial gripe from most educators that I've met in public education, myself included, and maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't, but if that's always this sort of back of your mind thought and you're feeling undervalued, I think that also speaks to, am I going more than halfway? Am I getting less out of this deal with society than society is getting from me? And maybe that is part of the gig. Maybe that is just, that's what you're signing up for. And if you don't like it, then fine. And then maybe that speaks to university prep work. And maybe there needs to be more discussion on teacher self-care and teacher mental health, and not how do you diagram out a reading lesson. So I think there's a few things that I'm kind of bouncing around with. I think that if teacher prep was more realistic, I think that would be helpful for
Mm-hmm.
kids that are coming up. And then for veterans that are in the industry to say, you got to give and take a little bit here, because this system is really making things stagnant when they don't need to be.
So how is the relationship with a teachers union? Let's say with like, is it a state level kind of union or is it a national union? I'm not familiar with it.
So we've got a local chapter, right, with our district, and then there's a state umbrella that we fall under, and then there is there are a couple national unions as well. So it does kind of filter down, um, depending on kind of what area you're looking at.
Got it. And do you feel like union seems to be such a contentious word right now in the United States, and realistically only 7% of all jobs have a union rep. And so with that, obviously teachers, I think, feel, and honestly probably need that, because I feel like when you look at other cases, like for example in Oklahoma and some other spots in the country where they seem to be doing most of the labor when it comes to the education, but they are compensated the least amount. And so you would hope that a union would ensure that there's at least a level playing field in certain instances and parts of the country in that way. Do you feel that unions have done their fair share of, have they done a good job in supporting and maintaining teachers' relevance, and or are they actually a hindrance to the public education system based on their everything's a no attitude, or everything is contentious for change, and like you were referring to with the tenure and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the union in the district where I've worked anyway, they've needed each other to be uh, a partner in cooperation, and they've also needed each other to be a heel and a villain. And I think that the system is set up in a way, where I've worked anyway, that there are times when there are very easy conversations and very easy contract negotiations, and there have been times where there are things that are just very, very contentious. Right now, the union where I am is working on a number of issues on behalf of teachers with respect to time and compensation with the different learning models, especially for folks that were in the secondary level that were trying to manage multiple learning models simultaneously. If we didn't have that representation with so many teachers working in one district, I think it would, the attention that you have to do a job, if it's then now being divided out to doing the job as well as representing yourself as an individual, it's going to dilute your ability to do both of those well. So I'm grateful that I've had union reps. Being a male in education, in elementary education, I've been grateful to have that protection of just parents looking sideways at a male kindergarten teacher. That's the way that I had to deal with things. So I'll never really be in a place where I'm going to say that I don't want to have that union representation, primarily because then I'm not equipped right now. If that union was disbanded tonight, I wouldn't know the first thing about what do I do to advocate for myself as an employee. I've never done that.
Right.
So selfishly, and our union right now has done, I think, quite well and quite right by what I'm hoping for out of a union, given, eyes wide open, this is where things are. But I can see how they can be interpreted and their actions seen as, let me put it this way. If the union isn't pushing hard to represent its people, then who should? So they may ask for more than they're going to get, and that's probably the way that it should be.
Yeah. Because there's always going to be compromise in a negotiation, and you're going to have to give and take on certain instances, and you never try to go with the offer that you initially want anyway. So
Yeah.
And like you said, like strength in numbers, right? Like teachers, I feel, are placed in such high regard in society, but are compensated completely opposite of the rhetoric that's being put out there in that sense. And it sucks because you spend more time with kids than parents do. Like during the school year, like there's no question about it. You have a vested interest in your community in such a way that, you know, from the administration standpoint all the way down, that I think just in a same sense of civil service, like military and other things, they simply they go unnoticed. And when you were talking about, you know, tenure and things like that earlier, it kind of made me think about military and retirement, right? Like I left after 12 years. That would be basically saying, like, I'm going to give up a pension, and possibly, you know, the more time you're going to be in that kind of job in a physical sense, you know, like the more disabled you might become physically, mentally, and what have you, right? But I had to make that conscious decision for myself and move forward in a way that was more risky, in a sense of I could have rode out the other 8 years, but like you said, my self-worth was diminished, where I didn't feel like I was doing myself or the people around me. If you respect the institution, I was doing them a disservice by being around. You know, there's nothing worse than being on a team with a disgruntled individual that doesn't want to be there. And so I'm sure you have that in teaching as well, but because they haven't planned any secondary options, they're just there, and you have to deal with that as an administrator, you have to deal with that as a coworker, and it just sucks. It creates such a hostile work environment in certain respects, and you don't want to be around that, and people don't want to be around you. With that, you know, you mentioned about being a male teacher. What do we need to do in the future, and who's the responsibility lie on to attract more talent within education from all levels, but then also where can we break that stigma of male teachers in our society? Like why isn't that such a draw, and to be a community leader in that same way for males in our society, do you think?
Yeah, it's a goofy thing, right? Because you think about stereotypical principal, you're probably thinking of a dude, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what compels a guy to go into education and then not stay in the classroom, right? So not even to go into the question of why is the male being hired over the female, because that's its own mess. But why are men going in and then looking to advance and not stay in the classroom in the first place? With elementary, there's such this gap between when you're with those students and when those students are entering into a decision-making time in their lives, when they're going to wonder, what am I good at? What do I want to do? So if I was influenced, and I was influenced by my fourth grade teacher, that was a long time before I was anywhere close to deciding, hey, I want to be a teacher. You know, I went into education because I started as a psych major. I took Psych 100, and then I decided I don't want to be a psych major anymore. The guy just plopped this massive 4-inch binder on the lectern at University of Maryland and just opened it and read. And I thought, well, if he's trying to weed out the people that don't want to, you know, you did it. And then I went into education because I wanted to be a school psychologist. And they told me, well, if you want to be a school psych, you're going to have to get an ed degree. You're just not going to get hired if you don't have an ed degree. So I backed into that degree anyway. And when I was student teaching, I fell in love with it. So if I fell into this by happenstance, and I'm in a position now where I am, you know, this quasi leadership role in the building, and I'm pursuing, you know, an admin license in the state of Minnesota, then you can't just hope that somebody else is going to follow that same stumbling path. So I think that you hope, and this is a discussion that are taking place in suburban schools now, of how can you make the environment more appealing for people of color, and how can you bring folks. This I think I said earlier, the town where I live is white. It is very white.
It's white.
Oh, yeah.
Is it white or white?
And
White?
it is very white. And we do have a number of families that are, whether they are biracial or they do, identify with cultures that are not from the United States, or they are not necessarily in that white category. What are those kids seeing when they're looking up from their desks? They're seeing a white person, whether it's a male or a female. And what can districts do to provide those entry points? Principals have been talking for a long time about, well, I want to hire somebody of color. Well, then what's going to compel them to want to come to you? Because being the first in the building is not something that people all clamor to be. So how can you provide that runway? How can you provide that opportunity to make it feel, this is a good place to work if you are going to be the first to do so, or one of the first in a long time to do so. Mm-hmm. And that goes along gender lines too. I think that it does start with, how can you build role model opportunities? If there are student teaching opportunities, how can you try to bring student teachers into buildings more frequently and to see different types of schools? But there's not a good answer to how do you change that pathway or make it more compelling. I didn't realize I liked working with kids until it just, like I said, it just happened. I figured everyone likes working with kids. Honestly, that was what I thought, that this is like the sky is blue. Water is wet. Everyone likes to be around kids. And it occurred to me that no, that's just not the way that people look at it. And that was jarring for me. It was not something that I expected was going to be so different.
It almost sounds like when somebody tells you that, and I'm not equating children to pets or anything like that, but when somebody says like, yeah, I'm not into dogs, you kind of look at them like, what? Is this serious? Right. Like in that same context, and you're like, so I totally get where you're coming from in that sense. With that, looking at everything you've accomplished, and I think it's awesome that you've taken an active role in being at an elementary in that sense. If you looked back 10 years from when you started, what and you were talking to yourself, what would you tell yourself now that you didn't know then that you wish you knew?
Well, let's see. So 10 years ago, I mean, my world was different 10 years ago. So the reason why I'm pausing and laughing is like my world has changed dramatically. And when I do this sort of thought exercise on my own, I honestly say, look, I'm very fortunate that I am the happiest now than I've been in my life. So if I told myself 10 years ago, I had a chance to talk to myself, I would say, just keep doing what you're doing, because it's going to get better from just a humanistic sort of perspective. And I'm very fortunate to have had that opportunity, that I was able to change the trajectory of my life and bring myself out to the other side of this. In terms of education, it's just hard because there's so much that you don't know you're going to learn. And I'm running into this with a colleague of mine who is 10 years younger than me. And I don't think of myself as 10 years older than her, but when she and I have conversations about, strategies or decision-making, I feel myself and I hear myself talking from this place of, I guess I do have some experience now. Even when you started the conversation, I don't think about, well, I've been teaching for, 12 years, or I left college in 2006. So how much has changed from that teacher prep work until now? It's just this slow accumulation of information. But I suppose that if I had to tell myself something, it would really be just keep doing what you're doing, because you're not anywhere close to where you think you are right now in terms of that grand, uh, arc through your career. But just keep working and keep listening to people.
How much mentoring at your level are you doing with the teachers and the staff to encourage them to constantly evolve and learn along with the students?
Oh, well, don't suggest that I'm a mentor. That's terrible.
I mean, 12 years in, I mean, that's you got a
I
little.
guess so, but so the building where I work are there's a lot of well-seasoned individuals there. So there aren't too many opportunities to have an audience of someone that wants to hear what I think is a good idea.
Is that a good or bad thing?
Doesn't bother them. That's its own animal too, because when I came into this role, I am on the younger side in this building, and people had no reason to trust me. I did not come up in this building. I did not earn any sort of accolades or accreditation from this building. I had a good relationship with the principal, and she put me into a role that literally nobody else wanted. But there was a period of time for a couple of years where it was, I was not given access. I had to find ways to earn access, which is how it should be. But when it's just this brick wall in front of you, it was challenging to find that entry point in, and I'm getting there. Needless to say, because this principal is now beginning to hire on her own staff through retirements or movement, there are certainly opportunities to try to talk to these folks. And if it is mentoring or coaching or just giving them a sympathetic ear, I think that for veteran teachers, it's hard to remember how much it hurts to be bad at something and not be able to lean on people for a good part of the day, right? Our job is really twofold. You got the kids and you have your coworkers. Mm-hmm. But between 9:15 and 3:55, you're in charge. Like there's not a lot of, hold on, let me just check my manual real quick. Give me a hot second here. So, you're on, and that's draining, especially when you suck at it. So, I think there's been a few occasions where I have been able to start those relationships with younger folks, with newer hires, to try to help steer them, one way or another with things.
Has being a parent helped you be a better educator?
No, I mean, the odd thing is that since I've had kids, I'm not in front of students on a regular basis anymore. It does allow me to think differently about decisions that parents make. And I learned a number of years ago this notion that a parent sends their best version of themselves out into the world through their kid. And anything that is a comment, a feedback, a critique, a positive, that parent will take personally. That kid aced that spelling test, that parent aced that spelling test. If that kid stole from somebody, you better be sure that you've got some evidence to back this up, because you're accusing that parent of stealing from somebody. And as a parent now, there is an appreciation for what a parent will do for their child and how they will receive any sort of feedback about that child. So I think it's made me better as a member of the school community. But I'm not working with kids or around kids that are the age of my own boys right now. Mm-hmm. So when my boys get older, I'm sure that I'll look at students that are their same age, right, differently. But right now, it doesn't really impact the way that I look at the students, more of the parent side of things.
And at the end of the day, is education one of those careers where either you love it or you bail out on it pretty quickly?
I've quit teaching twice, so I am not a poster child for straight and narrow. But that being said, I've come back twice as well. So I can't really see myself, I'll daydream a little bit every so often about sitting on a stool in a toothpaste factory and just putting the lids on the toothpaste and punching a clock. Like that sounds nice sometimes. Maybe for like a week, but then I think that teaching is one of those things where so many people have the opportunity to dabble in it in their own life outside of being a formal educator, that I think it does dilute the idea of what it means to be a teacher. And I think that that's one of the struggles that teachers face on a regular basis in our society, that, well, yeah, I've taught someone how to swing a baseball bat, or I've done golf lessons or whatever. So I know how to be a student, how to be a teacher, and this is why you suck at it. I think that there is something to the blend of patience and commiseration and sympathy and leadership that does have an embedded requirement to be good at teaching. Anyone could probably teach for a couple of years, but to that cycle of getting kids through 9 months and then going back to the very beginning, there's no harder day in my career, Ben, than the second year that I taught kindergarten. That when I got through May of the first year and these kids were now reading and using materials and cutting and gluing without destroying the room. And then you go back to September of the next year and these kids are like, what the hell is a chair? And why do I have to raise my hand? And like, to go back to that basic level.
Yeah.
It was like, oh, okay. So this is what it's all about. And to subject yourself to that cycle for your career is, some form of just mental torture, but to see the growth in the kids and to see the growth in what they can do and their abilities. If that doesn't drive you, then you don't belong in education.
Yeah. I just remember when you lived in Denver, you would tell me stories about the kids. And I think those kind of interactions and those bonding moments that you have with kids, especially at that age, because they're just so authentic in their thought process. There's no filter and they just let you have it. And you just can't help but laugh, And I just remember that one time when you're telling me about a kid, you're trying to help him with his jacket and you're trying to zip it up and something's stuck and he just like totally sneezes like right on your face. And you think about
in my mouth. Yeah.
Yeah. Like now with COVID and everything else, like, man, like things like that, just, they crack me up because, and I can understand like why the hardship of teaching or being a parent or being in that role in a kid's life, like all the headaches and the ups and downs, like nothing's linear with a child, obviously. And so those moments like bring you back. And I think, like you said, if you don't have that willpower to like push through some of those tough times to catch those moments of just brilliance, and brilliance, I mean, just in life, like the interactions that we have with each other, then it sucks, because you've spent a lot of time going down an endeavor and it's not for you. And that's a tough pill to swallow because people think of it as a loss. I look at it as like everything like that is value, unfortunately. And that will only propel you to be better at whatever direction you go, because you're just that more into being self-aware on like, this is not me. As much as I wanted it to be, it's not there. And the people that are going to stay, like you're going to have a more cohesive unit of educators, like moving down the that path. With that being said, you obviously are teaching in the public school realm. with how does public school have to deal with private schools in the same capacity in your area, and then also charter schools, and what is the consensus amongst parents? Do they think charter schools are better for the kids? Is there been a leaning towards pushing kids, if you have the ability and the means, to outside of the public realm? And is there anything that the public education system is doing to combat that?
Here it's really not part of the daily conversation. The public school does cast a wide shadow here, and I couldn't even tell you. So if this might answer your question, beside the point, I couldn't tell you the name of one charter or private in this community. There very well could be, but it is not something that we are feeling in the public school is influencing or having a major impact on systemic decisions here. When I taught in Denver, there were a lot more choices, and there were schools. My wife worked for a charter school, and it's a different kind of animal. And if you don't know the differences going into them, you're going to learn them pretty quick as an employee. But I just don't know if it's not something that's caught on as much here, or like I said, if it's just that the public system has been so well established that there's just not a foothold for alternative forms of education to really grab onto.
And then what does your school have in place for kids that are just above and beyond the average kids? And as far as like gifted education, are there programs set aside for folks to, if they have a particular aptitude, let's say in STEM subjects, to maybe push the envelope with them in after school programming, or something set aside for them to really see if they have a talent for something ahead of the game and kind of push the envelope for those kids?
Yeah, we have, it's kind of a unique system in our district where there's a gifted education specialist teacher for every 2 elementary schools. So we have 8 schools. We have 4 of these teachers, and they bounce back and forth. Of our 8 elementary schools, they all have something in-house that is offered to, I believe, every grade level. I don't know how low it starts. It could be as low as kinder. Don't quote me on that. But they have an opportunity to do some pull-out work in a group that they qualify for based on testing, as it is, among other things. And they'll spend some time with this teacher on a weekly basis. Then what makes it unique is there's a totally parallel program in the district that's housed at one of the 8 elementary schools that if you qualify when you are in 2nd grade, then you can go to that building for the balance of your elementary career and receive this sort of plus up gifted experience. So you got to get your transportation there. I forget if you have to get car ride or if they do a bus route for you, but once you're there, then you leave that home school and you're in that program.
Oh, wow.
I honestly don't know how it goes to transition up to middle school and beyond there, but it is this. I haven't heard of that elsewhere where I've taught, where it's bringing kids from all over the district into this one other building that are beyond that weekly pullout of these very bright and high scoring on these tests students.
Yeah. Do you feel a lot of that is just simply genetics? Like they just have an aptitude that they're born with, or is that something that's environment along the way and just really excelled in that fact? Like,
no, I mean, I forget the particulars of the study, but there's all kinds of research out there about the level of, you talk about college achievement, right? So the level of achievement of parents and the types of discussions that they have with their toddlers when they're like 2 and 3, and the types of questions that they ask them, and the vocabulary that the kids are exposed to. Even if you're pushing your kid in a shopping cart and, oh, that's an apple, and stopping there versus what other apples do you see? What colors do you see? Can you say Macintosh? Like, just having a couple extra cues over time exposes kids to literally millions of more words before they get into preschool age, kindergarten age. Whereas kiddos of parents that have a lower educational achievement level have something like 3 or 4 million words. The higher achievement level of the parents ends up getting to like 12 million words.
Wow.
I mean, it's a huge difference, right? So I think that genetics could play a part in it, but there's also a lot to be said about the opportunities the parents have and the environment that they can create through what seem like innocuous additions to their conversations that build up so much mass over time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's something to be said with that, but there's also something to be said for, is this kid interested in sitting for an IQ test when they're 5 or 6?
Yeah.
And maybe they're just not, and there's nothing wrong with that. But so you got this blend, right, of these different forces that combine. If the kiddo is interested, could yield that result, but the lack of interest doesn't mean that they don't have it. It's just they're not there.
Got it. How do you feel? I'm sure, like everywhere, English is a second language with some of the students. Do you feel that is a positive in a sense of the learning and having to, I know growing up with multiple languages, it affected my writing, obviously, quite a bit in a sense of conjugation of words, sentence structure and things like that. And where it's taken me quite a long time to get to that point. But as far as conversationally, I am actually fluent in multiple languages. Do you think that teaching language earlier in education or having another language spoken at home is a benefit to learning overall, or does it actually kind of mix things up in a different way cognitively and speech and things of that nature?
No, I mean, I honestly haven't heard of that hypothetical bearing out to say that, oh, 3 languages, that's terrible. But I think that if the next question is then how do you promote that in a public school setting,
mm-hmm.
I don't think that there's motivation to do that, right? So I think that there's this visual I was introduced to a couple of years ago of a person on an elephant. The person is logic, the elephant is emotions. And the person, logic, might think they can tell the elephant where to go. But if the emotions drive somewhere else, the logic isn't going to do squat. I don't think that there's an emotional attachment to building multiple language fluency, so that you could give me all the facts in the world why it's a good idea, and I would agree with you it's a good idea. I don't think that there is the emotional value from a system to say, what are we going to give up to achieve this? And that will be a better outcome. In most metrics, right, America is the fat guy on top of the hill. So what do we get from learning another language? We're on top of, you know what I mean? So it's a very cynical view of it. And I don't mean to be a completely obnoxious, stereotypical person here, but I think there's some merit to it. And I don't know that there's a lot that would persuade a system to adopt a change like that.
Yeah, no, I can't argue with you on that. I just think that inherently, you've been driven into your mind and in your conscience that America's number one, even though we're maybe lagging in certain things. But when you add up all the numbers, we're still doing pretty damn good. And I actually probably would agree with that overall. When you travel and you go around the world as we have, and you see the opportunity still here versus other places, even if you have a proficiency and an aptitude that is higher than the average person, unless somebody actually promotes you in some way, in society, it doesn't matter. At least here, we still have a little bit, and it's obviously, it's dwindled here in the past, 10, 20 years, but we still have upward mobility based on your intellect. When I think that's the reason why a lot of people tend to come here for university in the States to get a taste of that and to be a part of that in that facet. What do you feel that we need to advocate for more travel for kids in different age groups? Obviously not elementary, but high school age, to travel a little bit on school trips and things like that to other places and kind of see with exchange programs and things like that, to kind of maybe have a better appreciation for our education system and how we're structured as opposed to others.
Yeah, and I would say even beyond the education system itself, but just to be in another place, and not as a tourist who is doing touristy things, but if you are able to see how the goals that you have in your world are achieved in another part of the world, I think is a very powerful lesson that can't be replicated through a visual aid without that multi-sensory experience, right? So if it is, in a perfect world, if there were opportunities for something like a birthright experience, but for other types of groups or anybody, right? If you could have a chance to go somewhere and to be, steeped in that world for a period of time, I think it would only stand to benefit.
And I guess maybe the last thing I'll ask, do you like the way the education system is modeled today, in a sense of it being localized and not having a federal system in place to allocate resources and things of that nature? Or you think that would just be too problematic because we're just too big as a country to be able to do that on that level?
I think it would depend on what the goals would be if you wanted to federalize. So if it's to have a consistent output, or to say you're going to have the same experience, I think that it would be a very challenging thing to do. You could say this is your goal, but because we are such a geographically large, spread out, wide variety, and I guess that's not really unique to the United States in terms of a lot of perspectives and political views and things like that. I don't know that unless you would be moving teachers around, right? Okay, so I live in Minnesota. I'm going to go teach in Missouri. That's where my first tour is going to be, right? Unless you're doing that move, which isn't a terrible idea. But if you're going to have a federalized system, but you're going to have local facilitators, local educators, you're not going to achieve that federalized goal, in my opinion. So unless you completely federalize the entire system, then I don't know that you would be able to have that big of an impact. I think it would just get diluted and not carried out at that very micro level.
Got it. Yeah, no, my dad and I, we talk about that. He was debating on, like, after he retired, to be a teacher, but he ultimately opted against it because I think he was just dealing with a lot of the stigmas that you were referring to earlier about being a male and having to get into certain parts of the society and not having a lot of wiggle room within curriculum and things like that. Like, this is what you have to teach, that kind of thing, and he's, I would say, like a amateur historian, right? And I think there would be some intrinsic bias in his teachings in a sense of being more realistic and giving an honest approach to some of the subject matter. And I don't know if he would have been able to handle the backlash that might have come from parents and things like that, or just wanting to deal with that in a sense of, like, why are you putting your opinion in, like, some of the curriculum in this sense? And a lot of times I think it comes from a base of just trying to get folks to think and be appreciative of what they have. And so like he just kind of opted against it overall. With that, we talk about the federalizing of resources as far as that goes. That was one of the things. I would say politically like middle of the road, but he's just really adamant about equal opportunity, not equitable outcome, but equal opportunity. Like everybody starts at the same starting line, and then what you do with that opportunity is up to you. And obviously that's a great goal to have, but like you said, like the realism of that goal would just be so strenuous on our society, because you'd be taking away from districts and municipalities like your own to subsidize the other ones that have been lacking for years, decades, etc. And that's a tough pill to swallow for the individuals that have sacrificed and put in the work to get to that position of affluence in society in your district, to have to go and do that in that capacity. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's definitely a good conversation, I think, to have maybe in the future. Because if we have such disparity in opportunity, we're just going to end up in a lot of the same places that a lot of these other countries around the world are in, where the people that are either educated or in a certain level of society will always get those opportunities, and the other people, it's kind of a good touchy-feely story that this person, like for example, went to Harvard and he was in the projects, and that's the extent of that, in that sense. Do you feel that we're going down kind of that road? I mean, obviously nepotism exists in every society, but do you feel that the in education in particular, obviously not at your level, but overall on a macro level, that we're slowly kind of teetering towards a more nepotism society, a more nepotistic society?
No, I mean, honestly, thinking of my own experiences and, experiences that have been shared with me, I feel like with a more interconnected ability, there's a better chance that you can find somebody outside of your own, whether it's your own family from a very traditional idea of nepotism, or your very small, local community. I think that there are more opportunities for people to connect in ways that can be more efficient potentially, or have fewer conflicts of interest. It's just a matter of, do people want to pursue those and put in the time to find them? So I think that it's a matter of the access of the person who's seeking that particular person or that particular task, and their ability to make those connections. But I think that there's never been an easier time to fly halfway around the world and work for a multinational organization, or to have a connection across time zones, than there was when my folks were coming up, and my dad's father was a heating and air conditioning estimator, and my dad could have gone into that work because that's what his dad did, and he had those connections. He'd give him his book of sale, and then you just keep working in that industry. Or my mom came from, an accountant, and she could have stayed in his firm, my grandfather's, and done work there. So maybe it wasn't called nepotism before, and it was just, you're teaching the next generation. And, maybe nepotism has evolved to the sense of, you have the chance to look elsewhere, and you're choosing to look within. And there's more of that negative connotation to it of not exploring other options. But I think that it's much easier to have different perspectives if you want to seek them out, and to bring those perspectives on board in a much more efficient manner than there's ever been.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, even for myself, like after finishing grad school and using your alumni networks and using, let's say, your veteran network for myself, for example, anybody that I've generally reached out, I was thinking maybe a 20% success rate as far as a reply is concerned. it's been overwhelmingly over 50%. And I think it just has to do with people's time and what they can allocate to like reaching out and what have you. Most people are super receptive because they've been in that position, and the fact that you are hitting them up, you know, they're going to reciprocate the effort to meet you in that facet. And so I'm optimistic as well. I just wanted to see what your take was overall with the current situation, you know, like just, you know, the polarization of our country right now, education, and I think, you know, the overall security of our nation. There's a certain things that are just apolitical, and, you know, and I think that everybody's invested in that in the future. And it's good to know that folks like you that are doing it, not for the accolades, but just to understanding that you are community members and community leaders in a lot of ways, and you guys are there for the right reasons, you know. With that, you know, with your kids being so young, obviously, if they asked you to be teacher, to be in education, what would you tell them if they were going to school?
Yeah, I mean, I would try to be upfront with them and say, it's if you're not into it for these reasons, then you know, don't do it. I think that some of the things we talked about before with trying to capture those moments and helping to foster that growth is really paramount to it. But there's also an element of being a part of a team and being part of that professional community and working on both of those things. You know, you can't do one without the other. You really won't be successful if you're on an island in education. And if your focus is more on your coworkers versus your kids, you're not going to be renewed anyway. So it's a very unique blend of all of those things. But yeah, if they're into it, I would absolutely encourage them to explore it and look for chances to get into it before they start down that road of higher education and accreditation. It's like we were saying earlier, no matter what field you pick, you're never going to know. But if you can give yourself an opportunity to explore it on the front end and get a taste of it, it can only help you when you make that decision.
And how do you think you would do that? Through like having them volunteer and having those opportunities like within the community in some facet, or like what kind of, you know, chances would they have to like jump into roles where they could actually get a taste of what that feels like?
Yeah, it's kind of a goofy thing to think of them as like teenagers. But yeah, I would.
For those that don't know, they're 3 and 1, so, or 3 and 2. Yeah. So,
I would say that certainly if there are chances to volunteer or even to bring them in and have them just, you know, be in a school or to be in a classroom, I think that would be a place to start. But also, you know, just trying to articulate what it is that they like about what they like. So what if they are interested in teaching, then is it just because I do it and my wife does it? What do we talk about at home that they hear that they want to know more about? Do they have favorite teachers? You know, what would lead them to that place? So they're not just trying to, this is what I know, right? There's that risk of they're only going to be around teachers at the dinner table.
Yeah.
So, you know, is that going to color their view of, oh God, I never want to do that. And maybe they'd be good at it, or, you know, the opposite of that's all that they've heard. So it just makes sense to them and that they're going to do it out of habit versus, you know, being able to explore something else on their own.
Yeah. It's subconsciously, like, my dad was in the military for almost 30 years. It wasn't, I wouldn't say it was pushed on us, but it was familiar to us, right? So we have 4 boys. All of us have been in the military at some capacity. And it was just one of those things where you never know what you're going to get until you're into it. But at the same time, if it's done your family well, you might give it a shot, in a sense of like, why would your parent be doing this if they didn't get something out of it in certain respects? And so that always fascinated me is in a sense of, I didn't plan on being like a legacy kind of person in that sense, but at the same time, it was, looking back on it now, it was a perfect building block for myself, who didn't take my education seriously in high school anymore because I was bored, to be honest. It gave me the life skills to really hone in on what I'm good at, and then really be aware of like what I'm not good at, but then push forward. Like I graduated with a 2.0, something like that, barely graduating. And, I cum laude in bachelor, my bachelor's, and then graduated with a 3.7 running a business and being a consultant at the same time. So I think it's just like we were talking about before, like there's no linear path to learning, and there's going to be tough times, and there's going to be other times where things are just going to come relatively easy. But I think when you have failed in life in certain respects, but you just have to grind through the things that you don't want to do, I think that's really indicative of character on the individual persevering on delayed gratification,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need more examples of delayed gratification in society, where we're just not giving up because there's not a quick way to Google something, or, like the fact that STEM subjects are hard. They're supposed to be. I don't want the C- student building my rocket.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so
Yeah.
that's just been interesting in a sense of like, I think we're getting into a resurgence and a renaissance in science and technology again, because of the third, revolution here with the technology of the internet and things like that. Like we're just touching, I think, where we're going to be here in like 20, 30 years. And the faster that we can, I think, build, it's not so much the actual content, it's the ability to muscle through something that generally sucks right now and be able to capture that moment on showing success and perseverance and moving forward. And if you can get that instilled in somebody, that's a win-win, not only for the individual, but I think for society as a whole. Because it's the reason why I think when people stop wanting to move to America, that's when I'm going to worry, And we still, every education system has its flaws, obviously. But I think that the public education system has fared fairly well, all things considered. And we just need to spend a little bit more time and effort into cultivating a different environment to allow for the opportunity for all folks to want to maybe have the chance to go and see like what teaching is all about, and creating those moments of connectivity within our society, especially after COVID. I mean, I think people are just deeply longing for touch, for, having empathy for each other in situations that I think have been lost through some of the communication that we've done. And now it's a perfect opportunity to get those people that are in it for the right reasons into those positions to succeed. And, I wish nothing but the best for people like you that are going to be able to bring in new folks, and they're going to see the passion that you have for not only your job, but your life. And like you said, it's the happiest time you've ever been, in a sense of the accomplishments that you had professionally, privately, but like how that kind of, that synergy like really makes it all worthwhile. And I think that's something that somebody needs to see. You can't tell them about it. They're going to have to see you in action. So I just hope that those opportunities are going to come, to fruition for many more folks down the road here. But thanks so much for doing this. I hope you got something out of it. And I think most people are going to be fascinated with your level of knowledge, having gone through all that. And we touched on a lot, I think, of the general questions that I think people feel that maybe they don't have time to ask, and hopefully they got something out of this. And, you know, if we get some feedback and things like that and people want you to come on and talk about something more specific, hopefully you'll be able to hang out and do some more of that, or maybe do some Q&A.
Yeah, no, this was, it was great. It's stuff that I haven't really had a chance to sit and kind of talk through. You know, you kind of explore your own journey on occasion and you have a chance to share little parts of it. But no, it was great. I appreciate you having me.
Maybe next time we'll get the wife on too, and she can counter everything you say.
Yeah, probably almost all of it, I would suggest. So, yeah.
Well, awesome, man. Thanks so much for doing this. And yeah, we'll talk soon.
Okay, Ben. Take care.
The show is produced and engineered by myself, Ben, out of Denver, Colorado. Be sure to subscribe to our social media or wherever you consume content, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, etc. Big shout out to Mike Xavier. Thank you so much for letting us use your music as part of our show. Be sure to check him out as well on social media. And stay tuned for the next show.